awake to another form of existence. We dream. Most of our dreams have one characteristic in common. They don't follow the logic that governs our waking thought. Categories of space and time are neglected. People who are dead we see alive. Or we could dream of two events occurring simultaneously, move to a distant place in an instant, be in two places at once, be two people at once. Indeed, in our dreams, we're the creators of a world where time and space have no power. How do we know that what we dream is unreal and what we experience in our waking life is real? I dreamt last night that I was a butterfly, and now I don't know whether I'm a man who dreamt he was a butterfly, or perhaps a butterfly who dreams now that he's a man. So that's all from the opening pages of Erich Fromm's Forgotten Language, this real psychoanalytical classic from the 1950s. It was Lao Tzu. Thank you, Will. But Fromm's perspective is that all myths and dreams have one thing in common, that they're all written in the same language, a sort of symbolic language, a type of language where time and space are neglected, and rather the ruling categories are intensity and association. And he suggests that this is perhaps the one foreign language that each of us must learn. To understand the language of dreams is an art, which, like any other art, requires knowledge and practice and patience, maybe even talent. And Fromm says that rather than be confronted with such an overwhelming proof of the limitations of our understanding, we often accuse dreams of not making sense. Now, it's a cultural commentary from the 1950s, and we're all slightly, I'd say, esoteric, language-focused people here, but I wouldn't say there's been a tremendous seismic shift since then. Mainstream Western culture is pretty resolutely monophasic, as in sobriety is regarded as the most sort of real, valid mode of perception. And I've been really, really looking forward to this session because dreaming, it's kind of been on the peripheries of my fascination for several years. But it's been kind of an intellectual fascination. I sort of realized that I think about dreams much like I think about tarot, a sort of metaphorical content that I can choose to engage with or not, and how dreams might be a sort of a potentially useful approach to psychedelic meaning making, of learning not to take all visionary experiences literally or even seriously. But then a part of me thinks or even knows that that might be too rational. On a sort of practical experimental level, that dreams, they only really sort of come into the forefront of my attention if someone offers me an anergen, the sort of psychoactive plants or chemicals meant to enhance the dream state, which I've had very little success with. My last attempt was under the advice of Luis Luna in Brazil. We've been waiting for these brugmansia plants to flower for weeks, and it was incredible when they did, like sort of watching a birth over a few days. And he told me to crush 3 flowers and rub the oil onto my face and neck. For him, this is a fairly reliable way to induce lucid dreams. So I did it. And admittedly, there was a period of some amount of time in the morning where it was really difficult to tell whether I was asleep or awake. I sort of remember going outside and the sort of air conditioning unit blowing up. And then it happened sort of several times. But for about 3 or 4 days after this, I kept getting startled by stationary objects presenting themselves as animals, sort of like, a cow. I know, a bin bag. And I know it's a thing that happens anyway, but it was once every few minutes. It was all the time. And it was like embarrassing, sort of getting startled. But luckily, I'm not the one leading the session. But in planning the session and thinking about it over this last week or so, I've realized that actually my most intense dream experiences are sort of more vivid in my imagination memory than most of my psychedelic experiences, sort of lucid nightmares and endless false awakenings and sleep paralysis, which were all things I'd love to talk about with Sarah and William and Sam today, who Ros will introduce, actually our dream team.
So good to see you all here. We will start with Sarah, who has been a lucid dreamer since childhood and writes and speaks about lucid dreaming and dream culture and dream anthropology in all manner of publications and journals and festivals and conferences. And she's also a really prolific host of online and real life activities around dreaming and consciousness, notably her Egyptology Explorers series, and she hosts a weekly consciousness hour with exceptional human experience researcher Anthony Peake. And so we'll be sending an absolute smorgasbord of links out about all of these activities in the next email, but notably also her new book, which is called Dream Mysteries, Drinking from the Pool of Mnemosyne. And then we also have two longtime collaborators of Sarah's joining us. We have Sam Gandy, who is a PhD ecologist and independent researcher, longtime collaborator with the Psychedelic Research Centre at Imperial College. And it was Sam's paper that we sent around in the most recent email, which is all about how psychedelic and dream states can catalyze creativity and insight and contribute to scientific breakthroughs. And then we have Dr. William Rowlandson, who is a founding member of the Centre of Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred, and an environmental champion and a senior lecturer at the University of Kent in Canterbury. And William is the author of books and articles on Latin American and Cuban culture and political history, and Borges, Swedenborg, mysticism, psychedelics, and much, much more, and has been, as Reanne was mentioning earlier, the supervisor of her PhD. And so without further ado, let's get into it and into the dreams.
Yes. What we've asked each of the dream team to tell us about sort of initially is the dream or dreamlike experience that sort of changed your relationship with dreaming, that sort of led you down this particular rabbit hole.
Well, I always had really brilliant dreams from being a kid. I grew up in Croydon. I think part of it was this idea of dream compensation, where living in Croydon was quite boring. So I had these really exciting, exotic dreams. And one thing I do remember, and it was something that came up with a woman we interviewed as part of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour called Rebecca Sharrock, who's got highly superior autobiographical memory, which is this unusual kind of neurodiversity whereby it's often combined with being on the autistic spectrum and synesthesia. But it's where people have this incredible memory faculty, particularly for any kind of emotional memories, and they can remember everything that's ever happened to them. And she was talking, when I found out she was going to be a guest, I was like, I can't wait to talk to her about dreaming, because she must have lucid dreams all the time, because she can always remember who she is. And when I got to talk to her, she did indeed have lucid dreams, like all the time. They were always lucid. And one of the questions I really wanted to ask her, because it's something that I experienced as a child, and I wasn't sure whether I'd kind of made it up in my head, was whether when she was a baby and toddler, her dreams were all white, there was nothing there. And she said that she had this experience as well of having all white dreams, which is what I remember from being a baby and toddler. And then as I got a bit older, started to see first toys, and the first dream I ever remember is that I was playing with my favorite pull along chatter, I think it's called a Chatterlong Fisher Price phone, which was this little phone with a face that you could pull along. And it was ringing, and I answered it, and it was Wurzel Gummidge telling me that he'd just killed my nan. And that was the first dream that I can remember. And I used to make maps of my dreams quite a lot. And so I created this kind of feedback system, I think, between the dream world that I visited and my real world. I put it in all of my kind of art and writing and stories. And I think I created an interest and a sort of aesthetic bias towards anything dream related. So I loved, me and William have discussed previously, magical realism, like all books about dreaming. I loved Alice in Wonderland. I love Jodorowsky. I love all books and films about dreams and altered states. And I've always been into it. So I think you kind of create your it's a bit of an attention bias thing, I suppose, where I've sort of created an interest in dreaming, and I've curated what my dreams look like. So I think that over the years I've designed my sort of dream aesthetic, and I think of dreams as being like an oeuvre, like a film director creates an oeuvre of work, and you have your sort of motifs and your certain symbolisms that just always pop up over and over again in them.
So you get sort of continuity with your dreams then, in a way that perhaps lay dreamers don't.
Well, definitely something I've sort of learned about in my research into the ancient culture of dreaming is about how language forms dreaming as well. And that's something that I find fascinating. And I think it's something that gets overlooked in modern dream interpretation. And I think that when we dream, we're creating kind of architecture of the psyche. It's the memory palace of our entire personality. I think babies spend about 50% of their time in memory consolidating REM sleep. So they're working really hard to work out who they are, why they are, and what their life and world is. And I think we're constructing our personality in the dream state, perhaps more so than we do in our waking state.
What do you mean by language when you that?
Because words become forms and manifestations in the dream state. So if you were to write down your dream, you'd probably find that there'd be, and it's a massive thing in all ancient dream interpretation, is all about homophones, punning, wordplay, linguistics, essentially. And it's definitely something you can see when a word is written down, you recognize that that's a sort of visual representation of a word.
Oh, wow. Do you have any examples?
So say, for example, you might dream of an injury to your toe and knee, and that might be a reference to someone who's called Tony, and you've just sort of broken up the word and you've created like a sort of visual representation of the person. Or quite often what happens is you dream about someone from some distant past that you never think about, and you think, why did I dream of that person? But when you break it down, it's often something that relates to their name. And it's like whatever your unconscious has grabbed onto, whatever you can possibly use to sort of represent that idea.
That's incredible. I've never tried to do that. And how do you see that as relating to the sort of ancient dream practices then? That's this version of what they would do?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Nearly all dream interpretation in the ancient Near East and Egypt is nearly all about wordplay and homophones and punning.
Shall I come in? This is such a wonderful challenge to summarize, 40-something years worth of exploration of the dream state. And there's no way I could possibly sort of have a suitable introduction to all this extraordinary space that I've been exploring for so long. But I did think of one thing, and that is, it occurred to me years ago that the notion of lucid dreaming was of as much of interest to me as the notion of lucid waking. And I've been helped along my way in lucid waking through my deep relationships with the consciousness of woodland. And it's something that I've been exploring all my life, but especially in the last decade, maybe a little bit longer, but with a real focus and real intensity over the last decade of that which constitutes the not just the intelligence, which is a very specific, well, it's not specific at all, but the overall consciousness of a woodland. And of course, in order to tune into the consciousness of a woodland, one has to be able to enter the dream state. And I'm sure, Reanne, that Luis Luna, this is exactly his language, the language of the plants, the language of the brugmansia flowers, the language of, you don't speak to a tree in the same way that you speak to your neighbor. You speak to a tree and you hear from a tree, you listen to a tree by exercising the same language of mystery that you do in the dream state. And I think that this is, to me, has been a long process, on the one hand, of lucid dreaming and of recognizing, after years of exploration, that I had to sort of finally admit, I don't tend to have lucid dreams. And that what that means is, when I'm dreaming, I don't tend to, although I don't by sort of regularity, I don't know that I'm dreaming when I'm dreaming. That to me is really interesting, because at the same time, I don't necessarily, until over the last few years of real focus, know that I'm waking when I'm waking. Now, that's not, I don't mean the process of waking, I mean being awake. There's a wonderful word in Spanish, which is la vigilia. There isn't a good translation of la vigilia. El sueño y la vigilia. Sueño is dream and sleep, and la vigilia is the state of being awake. And I'll put it in the chat. It's a great word.
Oh, like vigilance. Vigilance.
Well, no, because
but not the no. I'm not translating it, but it's from the
Yeah, but it's not the same, because vigilance means being alert. La vigilia simply means the process of being awake. Now, I also have been guided here by the most profound guide that a person can have, at least, no, that's a silly thing to say. For me, the most profound guide that I've had, I've had a number of guides. One of the most profound guides, sorry, I'll get there eventually, is Jorge Luis Borges. Now, many of you will have come across Borges in your travels, and there's a beautiful little text, and I wonder if I can even remember it. I'm going to try and remember it. And he goes, remember it, hold on. I'm not looking at the screen. He says, yo me acuerdo hace años, tenía un hobby, he uses the word hobby, tenía un hobby con mi sobrino, tenía él 7 u 8 años entonces, mis fechas son bastante falibles. That's to say, he had this hobby with his nephew, and his nephew was about 7 or 8 years old. Cada mañana, él me contaba sus sueños. Every morning he'd tell me his dreams. Una mañana me contaba, and this is how it goes, he says, this is the boy saying, he goes, pues yo estaba en un bosque, había un claro y una casa blanca, y de repente apareces vos. Decime, ¿qué estabas haciendo en esa casita? The boy says to his uncle Borges, I was in a clearing, in a woods, in a clearing, and there was a white house, and suddenly you appeared. Tell me, what were you doing in that woods, in those woods? No, in esa casita, what were you doing in that house? And Borges continues, he says, todo corría para él en el mismo plano, la vigilia y el sueño. Everything occurred to him in the same plane, el mismo plano, la vigilia y el sueño, being awake and dreaming. So what actually happens in that dream is really interesting. The boy, 7 or 8 years old, is telling his uncle, yeah, so I had this dream, and and suddenly you appeared. What were you doing in that house? Now, he doesn't say, what were you doing in my dream? He doesn't say, I dreamt of you. What happens is his uncle appears in his dream. And I absolutely love that. I've loved that since I first read it at the age of 16. And it's, if anyone wants to find the reference, it's in a lecture that Borges gave called Siete Noches. Well, it's one lecture of 7 called Siete Noches, over 7 days in a university, I forget which, in the US. Borges gave a series of talks. He gave one about Swedenborg. He gave one about Dante and the Divine Comedy. He was going to give a talk. He says he was going to give a talk about Los Sueños. But actually what happens is, he said, everyone writes about Los Sueños. And obviously, as I know, Borges was a great reader of Carl Jung. So he knew about dreams, and he knew that lots of people wrote about dreams. And I just look around me, if I could show my camera, I've got books and books and books galore. I'm surrounded by books, and they're all about weird stuff. They're all about magic and dreams and shamanism and divination and just general. It's just my collection of weird shit. Just every author who writes about the weird stuff. But what Borges says is, actually, I'm not going to tell you about dreams. I'm going to tell you about la pesadilla. I'm going to tell you about nightmares. And nightmares is an interesting one, because actually, in all my exploration of Carl Jung, he doesn't write about nightmares very much, at least not about nightmares as we understand them, as being something which is like a dream, but which is significantly different. Anyway, back to Borges here. And what I love about this is Borges, I love this dynamic, and I think it's beautiful, the dynamic between this old blind man. Borges was blind from his sort of 40s late onwards, and this is when he's writing in the 1970s here. So he's blind, and he's talking with his nephew. Both of them live in that plano. They both live in that plano where la vigilia y el sueño are interrelated, and there's no separation between the two. And that to me is a really profound lesson. And the lesson is, and again, I'm gonna link here. This is something probably we'll carry on talking about over the evening. The relationship between the dream state and the state of death as well. Of course, the dream state you can return from, and obviously the death state one doesn't return from, at least not in the same way. And what I find really interesting here is that what constitutes being asleep and dreaming, and what constitutes being awake and, let's say, not dreaming, is impossible to distinguish. And therefore, in the same way that one might be dead and reading Swedenborg, or reading Frederick Myers, or reading any of the writers associated with the Society of Psychical Studies, the sense of somebody being dead and suddenly realizing that they're dead, or not realizing they're dead and being a bit freaked out. But when they do realize they're dead, then they can sort of move on. In the same way, you might be alive and suddenly realize that you're alive. Like suddenly, like, oh my goodness, I'm alive. Oh my word, I'm not dead. That's extraordinary. And in the same way, one can recognize that the same features of the dream world are perfectly apparent all around us. And that's what synchronicities are. And back to what Sarah was just saying about names. Again, obviously the third level there is fiction, and that's something we can also talk about, which is, the fictional world, the dream world, and the waking world. They're all intermingled, and the world of the dead as well. They're all intermingled. The world of hallucinations, the world of dreams, they're all intermingled. But the idea being, Sarah just mentioned, toe, knee. You dream of a toe, you dream of a knee, and then you associate it with toe, knee. Well, there is no reason at all to assume that in fiction, a name is symbolic. In a dream, a name is symbolic. But now that you're awake, the dream is not symbolic. So we're looking here, we've got Daryl, John, Sasha, Janet, Janice, Sarah, me, William, Reanne, Ros, just different names there. There's no reason whatsoever to assume that all these names are not highly symbolic. And therefore, the name that you have here represented on Zoom, but your name that you introduce yourself with, is just as symbolic in this so-called sort of materialistic, positivistic, functional, waking world. It's just as symbolic as it is. Or a creature that passes you, you're walking on the path and a fox walks past you. That's just as symbolic in the waking world as it is in the dream world. Or, if you like, just as not symbolic in the same way. You can dream about something and you just say, well, it's just a dream. It's not meaningful at all. In the same way, you can see a feature of your waking reality and just assume, well, it's not that meaningful. Sometimes, as Freud once said, a cigar is just a cigar. That's fine. But I find that if I conclude my little sort of opening ramble there, being just, let's say tomorrow in the daytime, or if you're in Mexico, it's daytime at the moment, to walk down a street and suddenly go, oh my God, am I awake? Am I dreaming? What's the difference? If I were to approach where I am right now as a dream, would I be approaching it in any different way? Yes, I would, because I'd be looking at things symbolically. Okay, so look at things symbolically. And boom, suddenly, there you go. How about that for a little opening ramble, completely unprepared?
The last person I was in a relationship with, he would more often than not wake up very annoyed with me because I'd done something in his dream world, and waking up was always quite a frustrating process because I'd get told off for something.
I like that. Yeah, you have to take responsibility. Yeah, what happens in the dream happens in the dream. And in fact, seeing as you've just mentioned that, there's something, Reanne, you've probably heard me mention this before, because I have mentioned it on many occasions. It's one of my little pet sort of narratives, and it appears in the in Memories, Dreams, Reflections of Carl Jung. And it's when, after his father has died, and his father, he dreams of his father, and he asks himself, he says, did I dream of my father, or did my father visit me in my dream? And of course, Jung, being Jung, promptly realizes that the question is an unnecessary binary, and it's a waste of numinosity. If we get to, it's the same question that we've had many times. It's saying, am I hallucinating, or is this really happening? It's like, well, you might fail to experience the moment if you're worried if you're standing at the doorway wondering what lies the other side. Go on through. And I find that a very interesting one. Jung thinking, did I dream of my father? Which puts the emphasis on himself as a creator of a dream, as a mental exercise. Or did my father visit me in my dream? Which puts the emphasis on his dead father having some agency and some autonomy to be able to communicate with his son through his son's dream. And ultimately, as you've heard, Reanne, you've certainly heard me say this before, is it A or is it B? And the answer is yes. Did he dream of his father, or did his father visit in his dream? And the answer is obviously yeah. Well, which is it? Yeah. Yeah,
exactly, because as soon as you fall onto either side of that, of not being able to interpret it metaphorically, I mean, that's a road to madness. But
I love the idea of that as a waste of numinosity. I think that's a brilliant term.
Yeah, the waste of luminosity. And the same is true. I mean, you've again, this was my rap in 2015 at Breaking Convention. I rather took a few people to task for getting too hung up on the question of ontology. And in fact, if those of you who were there might remember, I got everyone in the audience to repeat the word ontology like 13 times, and everyone said ontology, 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 ontology. And by the 13th time, the word was completely and utterly like bereft of meaning, which is what happens if you repeat a word. You could repeat any word,
semantic
telephone. That's the one. But of course, the question there was around entities, and it's a question that obviously a number of us have been exploring with great attention for years. That if one spends too long saying, what is the nature of these entities? What is their ontological space? Are they elves or are they pixies? Blah, 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 blah. The experience will disappear before one's had the opportunity actually to open one's eyes and look around and engage and enter into some kind of negotiation, dialogue, communication. And the point that the example I raised back in 2015 was, if I can remember it, it was you're you're visiting France. Yeah, you're in a street in Paris, and you ask somebody directions, and you say, excuse me, which way to the, I don't know, La Tour Eiffel, and as they're giving you the directions, you're absolutely just aghast, and you're going, oh my God, are you real? Am I dreaming you? Do you exist in your own autonomous, sovereign, ontological state, or are you just a figment of my imagination? Well, first of all, that's really rude. But secondly, you're not going to listen to the directions. And when he's finally finished telling you, you go, par là, à gauche, à droite, whatever, you're going to say, fuck, I missed it, because I was too busy worrying about what his ontological status is. So yes, don't waste valuable numinosity, Ros, by worrying too much about the ontological status.
I don't know if that's why I can never absorb directions, but I'm going to pay closer attention to whether that's what I'm doing next time they sail by.
I use that as an example.
Ontological conundrum every time you talk to
someone. I use that as an example because I always do that. If I ask somebody a question, I end up going, oh, I like your hair. Oh, that's interesting earring you've got on. Oh, I like your shirt. Oh, that's a nice, tattoo you've got on. I never listen to anyone's answer.
Isn't it kind of you to be stopping giving me the directions and focus on just anything but the actual directions?
That's it. So you can extend it to a sort of a more cosmic metaphor. Yeah.
Thank you, William. Sam, bring you in here as a
nice. Just to kind of to riff off the cosmic vibes, actually, like a little I guess anecdote of one of my explorations. So I found I've been a natural dreamer, maybe less so as I've got older. That might be slightly occasional cannabis use as well, potentially, but I found that when you pay attention and pay an interest to your dream life, because our culture doesn't, we think of dreaming, well, most of us, present company excluded, we don't think dreaming is particularly interesting or important a lot of the time. Well, maybe interesting, but certainly, it's just like brain noise, basically. So it's like, why would you want to kind of delve into that? And that obviously very much differs from other cultures in other part of the world, both past and present. And definitely found that you definitely reap what you sow in terms of putting that sort of energy in, and like once your subconscious has kind of realized that you're paying an active interest, it will start sort of like dancing with you and like paying you back. And kind of a little bit of a sort of, I guess it's very much on the continuum of, I guess, dreaming, but very much its own thing as well. But my mom is she's naturally had these out of body experiences, sometimes refer to as astral projections, which yeah, is not maybe the best term, because it's like, well, it's got loads of ontological baggage and loads of new age occultist baggage as well. So it's like, you know, it's definitely like a bit cringe, maybe a bit. Out of body experience isn't perfect either, but it's maybe a bit slightly better. And yeah, and I'd kind of got into lucid dreaming and stuff, and I'd had some, you know, pretty cool, interesting experiences. And then there was this like 4-day intensive course on how to leave your body and stuff in London. So I went down, I took my mum, and we did it together quite a few years ago now. And and she'd been scared of these experiences, I should say. They'd happened during like the early hours of mid-morning, between 2 and 4, usually when she was pretty stressed and going through stuff. And it would start with a spinning sensation in her head, and she'd be flying out of her body, and there'd be aliens, there'll be weird stuff. And yeah, so she had this fear because she didn't really know what was going on, but I was actively interested in trying to like cultivate and have these experiences. And then we went and did this course, and then we did like, it's a 4-day thing, and like they're teaching you their theory on how they think it works, but they're also doing lots of like deep relaxation, energy work practices. And what was quite good actually is they give you a suite of different techniques for leaving the body, and it's a subjective individual game. So one person's mileage or what works for one person does not necessarily work for the other. So having a kind of Swiss Army knife toolbox of different approaches that you can test was really good. I kind of like, yeah, I sort of performed in the opposite way that I was kind of expecting, in that I was the more kind of methodical scientific approach of doing breath work didn't do anything, like literally didn't do anything. Whereas the imagination exercise, which I thought I'd be rubbish at, was like, yeah, my legs came off, my hands extremities were going tingling with mad energy. But anyway, we were like, shit, we need to get the last train back and get to the Midlands. And so we ran for the train. And usually being on a train, anytime I can get pretty chilled out and sort of like have a bit of a nap or whatever, polished off like a bottle of organic wine on the way back. And that was like, didn't touch the sides. I was like, wait a sec, something's off here. And by off, I mean on, because I was like, that didn't touch me. That's an anomaly. And then we got back, and one of our dogs had puppies, so we're playing with the puppies and stuff. And it's about like, yeah, getting on to 2 in the morning. It's like, okay, I don't feel that tired, which is weird, but probably time for bed. And like, you know, usually my mum would have conked out hours ago, so that was a bit suspicious. So went to bed, and was lying in bed, and then like, yeah, I felt this kind of weird tingling, this electrical tingling. Something was off baseline with my, for lack of a better word, bioenergetic system. Something was off kilter and a bit funny. And I kind of, yeah, I guess the saying fall asleep, I fell into sleep, or rather sank into sleep, only it wasn't sleep at all. It was a never state of consciousness that wasn't asleep, and it wasn't dreaming either. It was something else on the old Venn diagram. And in this, I kind of sank into this old state, and then I suddenly came to. And I have to emphasize that the vividness, that the lifelike, hyper vivid, lifelike, this didn't feel like a dream in terms of the linear unfolding of it, the razor sharp clarity of it. It was just a different state of consciousness entirely. And I was kind of with my mum. She was driving and yabbering away, and we were kind of going around this country bend, and it was lashing with rain, and like see the rain falling in the headlights of the car, and driving this car. And then I kind of noticed we're going around this large kind of winding bend in the road, and I noticed this brick wall by the side of the road, which I'd only just twigged. And when I twigged it was there, the car went out of control, but it went out of control in a way that defies the laws of physics and acceleration. Like, it was like, yeah, the car went out of control, skidded, and went straight towards this wall. And then I was like, well, we were like, oh, well, we're dead then. Like, there's no way we're coming back from that, you know? So we held hands as we hit, and we smashed into this wall, broke on through to the other side, or at least I did. I kind of went through. I kind of lost my mum and lost the car. I was somewhere else because it wasn't raining. It wasn't nighttime. And
was there fear? Sorry, actually, what was there fear?
Yes, there was going into it. Sorry, yes, like that. So the moment the car went out of control towards the wall, the thing that made it very unusual and very undreamlike was there was a very, very visceral feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was on a roller coaster at Alton Towers. It wasn't like, oh, I'm just imagining and dreaming this, everything's going to be okay. It was like, no, this is happening to you in real time right now. And then like, yeah, went, so kind of smashed on through the wall, and then lost the car, lost my mum. And then I was kind of like, where am I? Because it wasn't raining, it wasn't nighttime. I kind of looked at the sky, and it didn't have a blue sky. There was like a pinkish twilight sort of tinged colored sky. I was looking around, and I kind of knew I was in nature, but I didn't recognize anything I was looking at. I knew it was natural forms, but none of it was familiar. And then I looked at the horizon, and there was this like outrageous sunset going on. And then I kind of like did a double take, and I was like, shit, that's not a sunset. That's a massive gas planet that the planet I'm on is orbiting. And this was before Avatar. I wasn't just like copy and pasting something I'd just seen in a film or something like that. Yeah, it was nuts. And I've never forgotten it. I mean, that was like a decade, that's quite a long time ago. And I kind of remember that in vivid clarity all those years later. And dreams you kind of have to write down, or they do sort of tend to fade a lot of the time. And so I'm really interested in that experience. I've got a paper that got accepted actually for publication, a qualitative paper looking at the transformative effects of these experiences on people. And I mean, it's been accepted a year ago. I don't know what the freak the journal's playing at, but that's a side issue. And what we found, admittedly in a small sample, but we kind of went deep with the qualitative approach, was that even a single experience, like an out-of-body experience, can change people's lives in quite deep and radical ways, and seemingly long term as well. And what was interesting as well was that near-death experiences, I'm sure people here are familiar with, and they're among the most deeply transformative experiences a person can undergo, in terms particularly regard the long-term change and the types of changes. So loss of fear of death in all people, or greatly diminished fear of death, changes in relationships, changes in identity and self-awareness, like very much kind of slotted onto the types of changes that people having near-death experiences undergo. And obviously the out-of-body experience is like often a core, not always, but a core aspect of the near-death experience. And from this study that I've been involved in, it seems like the out-of-body component of the near-death experience is like where the main stuff is actually happening. So yeah, it goes beyond dreams. There are other states of consciousness that are very interesting.
Sarah, how do you interpret that Sam's experience from a
it was good that when I was adjusting my seating position, I knew how long that story was, so I knew I had like some time to feel like well, we've discussed this because Sam was talking about it to me with regards to his experience of an out-of-body experience, and my experience of lucid dreaming is often falling through the body, so it feels like you're drifting through space. And I often do what's called wake-induced lucid dreaming. So from the hypnagogic state, you develop awareness of hypnagogia, and then I explain it to people like you fall down a hole like Alice in Wonderland, and you keep this kind of soft gaze on what's happening, but you don't lose the thread of your conscious awareness. And then by the end of that journey, you find yourself in a dream proper, but you're still like conscious and aware of what's going on. So for me, your experience to me does sound like a lucid dream, but the body leaving aspects of it, well, it's consistent with my experiences of lucid dreaming anyway. But I mean, I don't think there is like sharp definition between all these different states. I think it's absolute like spectrum fingerprint.
I would definitely agree with that spectrum. I think like lucid dream teacher Charlie Morley, because he sort of he's a lucid dreaming teacher, and he teaches, I think, with kind of a Tibetan Buddhist context. And obviously Jade, his ex-partner, is an out-of-body astral projection teacher, and Charlie was skeptical that that out-of-body experiences were anything different to lucid dreams, until he had one, or a few, and he was like, okay, that's its own sort of beast, and it was like very powerful, and you can kind of see, potentially unnervingly powerful. And he compared it to, like, water and ice, in that they're the same substance but different expressions of that same substance, taking on very different forms potentially.
Which is like Will's answer, like, are they the same or are they different? Yes.
Yeah.
I had a lot of experiences of out-of-body experiences as a child, and I think it was to do with the fact that my dad made me this really cumbersome, what are they called, cabin bed, and it didn't have a ladder, so I couldn't easily get out of it. So I used to kind of project myself out of my body when they used to try and wake me up in the morning, and I would sometimes do maybe like 15 times in a row out of my bed, getting into my school uniform, and just wake up over and over and over again, realizing that I hadn't actually done it yet. So I do see a lot of similarity with near-death experiences and deep false awakenings, and I think there's something about especially near-death experiences and OBEs that relate, because especially in the near-death experience where the body is undergoing so much physical trauma, there's an aspect of the consciousness willing itself outside of the body, and as a self-preservation kind of mechanism, I think. And they say that there's elements of that in the near-death experience, perhaps, that relate to animals that play dead, and ideas like that as well. So I think that it's all on a spectrum, and I've had lucid dreams that feel like near-death experiences, and some, I guess because I've always been dream focused, I've always thought of everything as being some aspects of lucidity. And lucidity in and of itself, like you were saying, William, is just a term that's been coined to describe a dream in which you're conscious. And I think likewise, like the first time I ever met William was at the first time I ever met William was at the Swedenborg House in London, when I'd just been to the British Museum, and I decided, like, on my way back that I was going to pop into Swedenborg House. Went upstairs and there was a lecture by William about South American magical realism, which is one of my favorite genres of writing. And then afterwards I went up to him, and I had seen him talk at Breaking Convention previously, but we hadn't met. And so I said to him, "Oh, that's amazing that you happen to be talking here. What a coincidence." And we got talking on the subject of dreams. And I think you said to me, William, "I don't know, how do you know you're not dreaming now?" And he said to me, "How do I know that all those badges on your jacket aren't like symbols of my life?" And I said, "Well, actually, they are symbols of my life." And in this moment, I had this like proper epiphany that I could be dreaming then. And as I thought it, someone in the front row turned around and they were wearing a cap that had embroidered on it, "Am I dreaming?" And then I really was like, oh my God, I think I really am dreaming. And I really thought in that moment that I didn't trust my grasp on reality. And I remember sitting on the train on the way home and trying to forget and trying to imagine myself as being like an indigenous tribes person that had never seen anything of the modern Western world, sitting on the train. How would I experience it when I don't have names and I don't have frameworks for everything? And I saw the seats as being like gold and blue coffin case of Tutankhamun, and I saw a train in the distance like a metallic serpent, and everything just kind of blended and went weird, because I just lost my framework of believing in everything being real for that moment. And I think those experiences of themselves create lucidity and dreaming, because I think lucidity and dreaming is about truly remembering divinity. And so ultimately it's about truly remembering the nature of reality.
Yeah, can I come in there? Thank you for Sarah, thanks so much for reminding me of that. I'm glad to see that I'm consistent. I've been banging the same drum for years now about sort of approaching your waking life symbolically. I think that there's one really perfectly encapsulated threshold that we can, if we cross, then everything is possible. And it's fundamental. It's what Frederick Myers explored, and he even gave it the title of his epic work, The Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. And that is, if we take the fundamental position that our self, I'll just use that easy word, self, exceeds the parameters of both the body, the name, the status, and the everything that surrounds us, and in particular, it exceeds the parameters of space-time. If we accept that, if we don't accept that, then we're in that difficult world of trying to puzzle what's happening and where and which way up and how many times and how often. And we're trying to say, was I awake or was I dreaming? Was it real? Was it fantasy? Was it left? Was it right? Was it up? Was it down? Was it in? Was it out? Was it, did I dream of it or did it really happen? And we're always going to be stuck on those binary questions. If, however, we take that fundamental proposition that we as beings, in whichever capacity we find ourselves to be, exceed the parameters, exceed the limitations of our body, our personality, our name, and space-time, then suddenly nothing is inherently mysterious. Of course, no, that's wrong. Sorry, I didn't say that right. It's wonderfully mysterious. It's beautifully mysterious. It's mystifying and baffling and extraordinary. But there's no longer that first threshold to cross. And I think about that in all these questions. I think about the fact that, for example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had many experiences, as all his research as well, of people who had, Colin Wilson is a good example of somebody who catalogues all these, as did Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of people who dream of somebody, or somebody appears in their dream at the moment that elsewhere they are actually dying. And of course, the First World War was that what carnage, what absolute horror, and what loss of life. And of course, all over, let's say England, there were people whose sons, brothers, fathers, brothers-in-law, uncles, in particular men, more than women, because that was the nature of soldiery, they appeared to their mother, their sister, their wife, their father, their whoever, on the night of, the 13th of December, and they appeared to them in their bedroom. Sometimes there was communication, sometimes they just appear. They just stand there, sometimes in their military uniform, sometimes something else. And it's later, the day after, or 2 or 3 days later, or however long later, it doesn't really matter how long later, it's confirmed that that was the moment they died. And Sarah, no doubt you're familiar with so many of these stories. I'm sure many people here are familiar with these stories, because they are, again, the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in his History of Spiritualism has many accounts of this, as do all the archives in the College of Psychic Studies and the archives of the Society of Psychical Studies. All of these accounts. Now, it's not inherently impossible. That's my point. It's not inherently impossible once we just overcome that initial. Sorry, I thought somebody was saying something to me. It's not inherently impossible once you overcome that threshold. Once you cross that threshold of saying, we exceed these parameters. Therefore, in our dream body, once we're asleep and we've let go of our anchor in this body, in this meat sack, well, anything is possible. Anything is possible from, as people do, and I've done this over many times. I'd love to share my experiences, but perhaps not now, of having arranged to meet somebody in a dream. And there's one friend of mine in particular, and she and I have met each other by arrangement in dreams, as you mentioned, both Sam and Sarah, to astral projection, which is effectively a kind of a willed dream state. And just one more thing I'll say before I pass over the mic is that Cameron, whom some of you know, Cameron Adams, and I have for many, many years now, we drum together. We either drum together just as buddies and we just get together and drum, or we also, as we've done in many, many, many workshops, too many to number now, We do the shamanic drumming for people lying down on yoga mats with a rug over them, with eye patches sometimes, or generally in darkness. And what I'm always fascinated there is that we are inducing, through the steady repetitive beat of the drum, boom, 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 maybe not that quick, boom, 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 unchanging beat of the drum and shakers. We are, the way I've presented it, and I've looked back over the whole sort of the science of this, going all the way back to the strange Grey Walter, whom William Burroughs was in contact with back in the 1950s. The idea of brain states and brain waves and the different states of which we enter with dreaming, REM, etc. I slightly struggle to hold on to all these more neurological definitions. Sam, you're probably better equipped than I am for this. But what I certainly feel from my own experience is that what we're doing, strangely enough, is we are inducing the dream state with the drum, whilst at the same time preventing people falling asleep, which is very peculiar because the drum's quite loud. It's quite in your face. It's this, right, only a couple of yards from you, there's somebody banging a big fucking drum. And so therefore it induces the dream state whilst preventing the sleep. And I've seen this time and time and time again, where people have gone into places that they really had no conception. They had no idea that this was possible. And the stories, I mean, I've written down many of these stories, not giving names to the people for, just for sensitivity, but people who've had experiences of communication with their dead grandfather, people who've had moments of inspiration for an art project they're working on, for an essay they're writing, for a poem they're writing, people who've had experiences of power animals. I mean, that's not something that we often actually sort of try and sort of work people towards, but the experience people have is quite astonishing. I mean, and I say astonishing for us, but also astonishing for the people who weren't expecting to go that deep. And there was one friend of mine, I'll end with this a little bit. There was one friend of mine who's a long time psychedelic user, and on one of the sessions, when we finally, after we'd all come around and we were talking and we were chatting and everything, he said to me, he said, "Bill," he says, "you dosed me up bigger than anyone's ever dosed me before." And this is a man who's eaten more drugs than most of us had cups of tea. And yet it was just the drumming that took him to a space that he'd never been to, despite all his many experiences. And I find that fascinating, because ultimately it's a dream state. And yet, of course, you're still nevertheless conscious of where you are. It's a very interesting place. There you are. I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. I'd love to pick up on the many threads I'd love to pick up on, but one in particular, the idea of sort of people dreaming of people in the moment that they die, and how that really coheres with this idea of everything as a sort of continuum. I remember when my grandfather died, my grandmother was awake and she was coming down some stairs and she fell down the stairs, and we worked out that must have been within minutes of him dying elsewhere in hospital. And I wonder whether you guys see dreaming as a state that's particularly conducive to sort of psi.
I think so, and I really do believe as well that dreaming probably did encourage the first ideas about an afterlife, an existence beyond death, because one of the main aspects of dreaming is that you can see deceased people. I read a little quote from, I think it was an archaeologist digging in Israel, who said that, you have to bear in mind that ancient people might not necessarily have viewed biological death in the same way that we do. And that's really simple. So I think there's a lot of equating death with an eternal sleep in the ancient world. And there's a lot of preparatory rituals to do with how you get a body ready to enter into death as well. And there does seem to be, like, the earliest forms of dream incubation and sleep temples are about sleeping with ancestors, with deceased people, with going to graves and sleeping on graves, with sleeping in necropoli and things like this. So I definitely think that dreaming played a massive part in the formulation of spirituality and religions and gods and goddesses. And even with regards to things like when you see zoomorphic forms and you see like unusual scaling in cave paintings, where I think of my own dreams where instead, because you have this kind of omnipotence in the dream state, you can see close up and far away at the same time. So when I see, say, insects or birds, they're big, they're much bigger than they are in real life, because my awareness creates the scale of the dream content. So I think that that's something that's reflected in like early cave art and early representations of these forms that have often been taken to be like either aliens or psychedelic induced. I think they could also be related to dream states as well.
Yeah, no, I think definitely the dreams, not just the dream state though, the hypnagogic state as well is conducive to zany blips of telepathic weirdness and stuff like that. I remember there was kind of like some scholar was trying to make a case that a suspicious number of angel sightings as reported in the Bible seem to be with people coming out of and going into sleep, like some of the reports, and trying to make a link. Well, it's that sort of like that liminal state between waking and dreaming, and psychedelics. There's definitely a link there. Like Dave Luke talked about the link between psychedelics and psi weirdness, and it seems like making the point that it's so common that it doesn't really it's underreported because it's just like part of the terrain. And just a little and I just want to say, like, regard to the differences between these experiences, whatever the underlying mechanisms, it's important not to judge them just on their roots, but also on their fruits. And I think that's a different way of kind of assessing them. And in my view, not just like looking at the research and hearing people's experiences, there's a big difference between near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, lucid dream. Like they can all be, well, they span a spectrum in terms of the impacts that they have on people. So we need, there's different ways, I guess, of kind of assessing their power in terms of how they affect people. You could say it's all just down to a matter of interpretation, but it might be a bit more nuanced than that perhaps as well.
I think that reminds me of the kind of ancient categorization of dreaming and how they didn't have a word for lucidity in the ancient world, but they definitely had this like difference of a divine dream. And for me, that could be anything. That could be an NDE, an OBE, or a lucid dream, because I have lots of lucid dreams that don't have that divine ecstatic bliss element. And I think the divine ecstatic bliss element is the kind of the essence of those transformative experiences. And I've started to kind of use the term divine dreams when I talk about lucidity now, because a lot of the descriptions I've read of ancient dreams that were transformative for people are about experiencing divinity and experiencing an audience with a god, perhaps. So one of the best tips I have for like becoming lucid is having a crush or having like a really strong romantic desire towards someone, because then when they appear in your dream, you're more likely to become lucid because you get excited and you want to see them and you want to spend time with them. And it's, I remember it from being a teenager, like that was like my main thing to do with lucid dreaming. And for an ancient person, often these dreams would be incubated in temples that were associated with a particular god or goddess. So you'd go to a temple with the intention of having a divine encounter with this being. And when you had this amazing, ecstatic, blissful encounter with this divine being, I think it would be incredibly likely to provoke an episode of lucidity because you'd be so excited and awestruck. And I think ecstasy is, if you think about in the sleep temples, there was this idea, especially in the ancient Greek sleep temples, this idea that you could be healed spontaneously in a dream. And I think that potentially could happen with a placebo effect of a dream action having real life biophysical results. So, for example, some of the dreams described would be the god Asclepius, the god of dream healing, performing some kind of physically impossible operation on someone. So say, for example, they were suffering from interminable headaches. Asclepius would come along and cut their head off, empty all the bees out, and then sew it back on. And then that person would wake up without headache. And I think that if we look at something like, say, having an orgasm in your dream, where in response to dream things happening, you actually provokes a biophysical response in the organism, then perhaps in some way that sort of bliss and ecstasy that you experience in dreams is like a healing event in and of itself. And when we're dreaming, when we're sleeping, at least, we have genes that are switched on that modulate and regulate the processes of homeostasis. So I think there could be the most deep entanglement between mind and body during lucid dreaming, that if it's actually kind of directed towards a goal like healing or revelation, that you're much more likely to have a positive effect in the lucid dream state in terms of placebo faith healing response, because your mind and body is in this kind of deep entanglement that it rarely is.
And you can sort of prime yourself for that by believing it, I suppose,
yeah. And in terms of ancient people that believed in gods and goddesses and these kind of earthly, chthonic and animistic powers, then you're even more primed. You know, if you walked around the ancient Greek sleep temples, they were completely covered in what were called the ayamata, like dream narratives where the god had successfully been healed to see someone. So it's like neural linguistic programming. You're going in there, you've been told that this is going to happen. And I think it's quite likely that for a lot of people, if you think about it, most conditions, if they're not too acute, will resolve themselves over time. And really the sleep sanctuaries, especially those dedicated to Asclepius, were designed to be like spas. You did cold water bathing, you did purging, catharsis, expressive art, drama, music and singing. And you were fasting, so you were purifying the body. So most stuff would right itself after a period of time anyway. It's something that the NHS could look into, I think.
Oh,
Reanne, your question is actually can be brought back to that sort of foundational perspective that I was saying earlier. What is psi? Psi is everything that defies the standard description of reality. And the standard description of reality in the Western industrialized materialist world is that, as I mentioned earlier, our self is contained within the parameters of the body. And that which happens outside the parameters of the body is totally unfunctional. It's just, you know, somebody could dream about you or even think about you, but that doesn't actually have any agency. Neither do you when somebody thinks about you. So psi is everything, absolutely everything that takes place beyond those parameters, whether it's ESP, whether it's telepathy, whether it's telekinesis, whether it's, let's just carry on. Basically, let's take any of the books of Colin Wilson and just go chapter by chapter by chapter. Every single one of them is based upon that foundational principle of something occurring beyond those established principles that are axiomatic. And therefore, the way I see it, and I think, Sam, you're quite right to say there's clearly different flavors, in the same way that if we imagine a community that is bound by a rigid wall around the community and nobody can leave, and nobody even knows that you can leave. Let's just imagine, I'm sure Ursula Le Guin has probably got a good example of this, of a community living completely within its own defined geographical state. Not everything that's outside is the same. You can go to, if you were to go outside, you could go to the mountains, you could go to the ocean, you could go to the rivers, you could go to the forest, you could go to the marshland, you could go to another nation, another community, basically the world out there is limitless in its possibilities, and clearly massively categorically distinct from one place to the next. And therefore exactly that, an out-of-body experience is going to be different in many respects from a dream, which is going to be different in many respects from a near-death experience, which is going to be different in many respects from astral projection, etc., etc., etc. And off we go with, sort of listing all these different phenomena. and yet they're all based upon that one principle, which is it's outside the walls. It's outside the, it's, you know, you got to go out
where you
the
draw the
gate.
category line, where you put the category. Yeah, category.
That's it. And as long as, and I think that's why I'm kind of returning to that. I've never presented it in that metaphor before. It's just occurred to me now, the idea of a sort of a walled community. But ultimately, we do live in a walled community, and what we're all doing here, and what we've all been doing in our own respects and our own conversations and our own explorations, is trying to see what's beyond the wall. And what's beyond the wall is extraordinary. And in fact, it's actually where most of reality takes place. And I just look at my books, you know, all the poetry, all the art, all the visionary work of creativity. That's all inspired by that realm that lies beyond the walls, completely.
Sarah, when do you sort of decide when to make a sort of linguistic analysis of, like, perhaps the river Wandle has a particular meaning, and when to not do that?
Oh yeah, I do it with absolutely everything. So like William was saying about our names and how our names have meanings, and I think that your name is like the first spell that you're given when you're born. And I think my name is Sarah, and that means that I'm the daughter of the sun in ancient Egyptian, which I appreciate because I was born on the summer solstice. And Croydon means crocus valley, and Wandle, you know, I love etymology. And you know, when Maya was talking about James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake, there's something dreamy about going to like the root of words and working out how they are kind of holographic in a sense, and that they reflect the whole world, or they you know, the right word with the right root is, it kind of opens up a whole different meanings that have, you know. And that's why hieroglyphs are amazing, actually, because they're pictographic, but they have phonetic values, but they have this different, you process them with different kind of brain systems because they're visual, so you have all this association with them as well, and dreams are association based. And so when I started to learn hieroglyphs, you start to dream in hieroglyphs, and you start to see the world as being like a living world of signs and symbols, which is similar to I guess like the dreaming Outeringha, the Aboriginal system of everything being this continuum of consciousness, as William was describing, that there is no definition, and that this definition is a fairly recent phenomena, really, of us distinguishing ourselves from the rest of the natural order. So I think dreaming is a return to being absorbed by the full natural order, if you see what I mean.
That's beautiful. I'd love to hear more about hieroglyphics. I've just been writing about Chinese characters. I did Chinese at university, how that the radicals that they're composed of, Chinese characters, are often sort of reflections of things in the natural world. And I was just writing before I came on this call about how the character for intelligence is a combination of sun, arrow, and mouth. So those three radicals make up the sort of Chinese term for intelligence. And I wondered whether that something similar happens in hieroglyphics.
Oh well, I can show you some hieroglyphs. If I can share my screen, I can quickly show you. If you don't know anything about hieroglyphs, it will give you some kind of good overview when you next go into museums. Let me see.
That'd be really cool. Thank you.
Okay, so in ancient Egypt, there's this idea that words are magical thought forms, and the word hieroglyph is a Greek invention, which means sacred carvings, but the ancient Egyptian word for hieroglyphs is meduneja, which translates as God's words. So hieroglyphs, cuneiform, most of these really ancient languages come from purely pictographic earlier forms that then evolve into more kind of standard hieroglyphic scripts. So some quick sort of basics about hieroglyphs is you can read them from left to right or from right to left. It depends upon which way the animals and the people's faces are facing. So this is the cartouche of Queen Cleopatra. So you read that into the lion's face. The first glyph is this hill, so this is Cleopatra, and then these are determinatives. The T which is half a loaf of bread, is determines that this is a female, and then this determines that it's also a goddess as well. So these is some of my favorite hieroglyphs. An ejaculating phallus. This is the phonetic value mut, and so this is mutmuten, and they were incorporated into the word for exact moment. So this set you would read facing into the vulture's face as well, and then this set reads the other way, and the cartouches contain the names of the different individuals. So in hieroglyphs you have what are called uniliterals, which represent one phonetic value. So if you go to Egypt and you get your name in a cartouche and a gold medallion, this is what you'll generally be using. And then you also have biliterals and triliterals, and these are signs that have different consonantal values. And like in Arabic, like you were saying, the vowel sounds aren't written down, so it's been determined from the evolution of the ancient Egyptian language that was represented by Greek characters through Coptic. And so you've got biliterals and triliterals, and then you also have determinatives and phonetic complements. So when you see words, there are some that are sounded out and the determinatives are silent, but they determine what kind of a word it is, or they indicate the exact word that it is. And then phonetic complements are signs that are used to identify the correct phonetic pronunciation of a word as well. And then in Egyptian, you have hieroglyphic scripts. So these are the signs that you would see inscribed in tombs. Then you have hieroglyphic book writing, which is basically the exact same signs, but written with ink on papyrus. And then hieratic is like a priestly type of script and a shorthand version. And demotic is the kind of final stage in the representation of the ancient Egyptian script, and that's kind of a scribble. I mean, when I look at demotic text, I find it amazing that people can read demotic because they just look like a couple of squiggly lines. So yeah, Coptic is the language that enabled people to have some understanding of what ancient Egyptian used to sound like. And you know, the idea of language and words being fundamental to this idea of dream interpretation, I think does actually stem from this idea that words and language is a gift from the gods, and that gift has a cosmic origin is really important as well. So in the ancient Egyptian cosmogony, language and writing especially is given to humanity by Seshat and Jehuti or Thoth, and they're both cosmic architects. They're involved in magic, writing, the night sky, measurement and time. You can see Seshat here, she has a palm frond with the notches on it, and this is how she measures time out. And you can see there's a little tiny frog sitting on top of this Shen ring, which denotes time and eternity. And this idea that language has a cosmic origin is really interesting in the ancient Near East, because they have, in Sumerian, there's this term Shita Shameh, which means writing or script of heaven. And this, I love this idea. So this is the idea that the sort of primordial writing is the stars themselves in the firmament, and that if you can read the stars as a language, as a cosmic language, then you can know the future. And it's important in ancient dream interpretation that nearly all dream interpretation is about knowing the future, and so it ties dream interpretation in with all nighttime oracles, all kind of astronomy, astrology, and celestial omina and things like that. And then one other little thing that I'll say before I go is this idea that Maya put forward when she was doing Finnegan's Wake presentation the other day. I loved her idea of the sea being the land of the dead. And I think that there's real meaning thinking about the sea of the dead being the sea at night as well, when it reflects the starlight, that there's this kind of extra layer of liminality, that there's this altered state of the sea and of nighttime, where nighttime in the ancient Near Eastern perspective of the stars were conscious beings and gods. And so there's this lovely idea as well in dream healing in particular of astral irradiation, where you'd lie underneath the gods at night and their light would infuse a patient's body and heal them. And so I don't think it could be underestimated, this idea of how potent and powerful the stars were, and that they were the earliest form of writing. So writing then develops this reputation as being a magical form, and you can change your reality by writing things. And in particular, the dream is this kind of incubatory realm where I think it has the most power to change your reality, because especially if you get into wake-induced lucid dreaming, you recognize that as you're falling asleep, whatever sort of suggested to you in those last sort of moments as you drift off becomes like actual solid material in the dream realm. So you have this experience of manifesting your desires and your thoughts instantaneously, which I think to a lesser extent is something we experience in our waking world as well. It just happens less instantaneously. But the more relationship you can have, the more continuity you can create, I think, between your dreaming and waking self, then I think that there's a good opportunity to create a better version of yourself, which ultimately, I suppose, is what everyone wants to do.